On a separate issue, Mr. President, I'd like to tell the Senate about an experience which I had several months ago. I was in an immigration court in Chicago. Never been there before. It was in a high-rise office building in the Loop in Chicago. The corridors were packed with those waiting for an opportunity for a hearing. I went into this courtroom where a judge was sitting and saw the two people who were before the court that day to have their case heard. The judge called the courtroom to order. She was very respectful to the two individuals who were there, but she had a problem. One of the people before her could not get into the chair to sit down for the proceeding. And the reason that young girl, whom I'll call Maria, could not get into the chair was she's 2 years old. 2 years old. One of the volunteer attorneys lifted her up and put her in the chair and handed her a stuffed owl, which she clung to through the whole hearing. Now, the other person who was being subject to a hearing that day had no trouble getting into the chair. He scrambled into that chair and sat down because he was anxious to play with the Matchbox car that was on the table. This young man, whom I'll call Hamilton, was 4 years old. In the United States of America, in the city of Chicago, in an immigration court of this federal government, these two individuals were up for a hearing because they had been separated forcibly from their parents. There was no real conclusion to the hearing. They reset the next hearing date for these two children, 2 years old and 4 years old, for 4 days before Christmas. How did we get to this point in America where we're actually having a federal court hearing of an immigration court for a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old? One too small to even get into a chair by herself, and the other who, thank goodness, found a Matchbox car to play with during the proceeding. We reached this point because of the announcement of the Trump administration of something called zero tolerance and the decision to separate over 2,700 children from their parents at the border. Where are we today? We're in a situation where 136 of these children, months after this policy was started and then discontinued, 136 of these children are still being held by the government. 96 of them have parents who we believe to be outside the United States. Just this last week, the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General came out with a report, which I commend to everyone, analyzing what the zero tolerance policy meant. I'll tell you what it meant. It meant the absolute ultimate when it came to cruelty and incompetence. What they tell us in this report was a decision was made by the Trump administration and by the Department of Homeland Security under Secretary Nielsen to separate children from their parents even before these children had the ability to speak. They were called pre-verbal children, and they separated them without any plastic bracelets on their wrist, without any fingerprints to trace them back to their parents. They were separated not by blocks or even a few miles, but sometimes 1,000 miles. I came to learn the story of the little boy I call Hamilton because it was published in the New Yorker. It was a story about his mom from El Salvador and the little boy being taken from her in March. Taken from this mother. They left the mother in Texas in detention, and they transported the child to Chicago. Initially, a volunteer lawyer came in, bought a phone card, and said to the mother, "You can call him." And she did. And they would talk for a little while and sing a little song. The next time she called him, he wasn't as responsive. It has now reached the point where that 4-year-old little boy will not speak to his mother on the telephone, will not communicate with her. The people at the shelter in Chicago have begged the mother, "Tell him he has to eat." Did you ever see a little 4-year-old boy that you would have to tell you have to eat? It says something about his state of mind. Sadly, this 4-year-old has now reverted back to diapers and won't say a word to his mother on the phone. separated by a zero-tolerance program of this Trump administration. Well, what they tell us from the Department of Homeland Security and Inspector General's office is we are far from the end of this sad, disgraceful chapter in American history. Who is going to be held accountable for this? Will it be the president, perhaps in some election in the future? Will it be the Attorney General who proudly announced this new program of separating mothers from children? Will it be the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security who separated these children, according to the Inspector General's report, putting them in confined spaces which were unacceptable by humane standards, which we've actually been governed by for years in the United States? I believe Secretary Nielsen should be held responsible. I believe she should resign. Someone has to answer for this disgraceful chapter in American history. And we still must remember 136 eligible children are still being held by our government under this policy. It is time for us to reunite these children with their parents. Except in the most extraordinary circumstances, it is time for us to try to put these families back together again. I want Hamilton to start eating again. I want him to be in his mother's arms again. I want him to try to get over this chapter in his young life. It could affect him for as long as he lives.